It was the dead of winter when I moved into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of place you can only find in stories. A centuries-old structure, heavy with history, sitting at the edge of a snow-covered forest. The realtor had warned me that the house had been vacant for years, but I didn't mind. It was isolated, quiet, and affordable. Perfect for a fresh start. The first few nights were fine. The house creaked in the cold, settling with every gust of wind. But it was comforting, in a way. The crackling fire in the hearth kept the chill at bay, and I spent my evenings reading or staring out the windows at the snowy landscape. But on the fourth night, something felt off. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway. At first I thought it was just the house settling again, but these steps were too deliberate, too slow. Someone was walking, deliberately, as if they were pacing outside my door. I held my breath, straining to hear, but the footsteps stopped before I could get up to investigate. I thought maybe I had imagined it. After all, the house was old, and it had a way of making sounds. But the next night, the footsteps came again, only this time they were followed by a soft knocking on the door. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath, swirling in the dim moonlight filtering through the curtains. That's when I heard the whispering. It was low, almost a hum, but unmistakable, a voice just out of reach. Leave. I bolted out of bed, heart a-racing, and ran down the stairs to the kitchen. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the isolation getting to me. But the longer I stayed in the house, the more I could feel a presence. The cold would seep in, even in the middle of a fire, and sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. Just shadows, fleeting, but always there. I decided to leave the next morning, but when I opened the front door, the snow outside had piled up higher than ever before. It was as if the storm had intensified overnight, blanketing everything in a thick, impenetrable layer. The door slammed shut behind me with a force that made me jump, and the whispers returned, louder now, echoing in the stillness of the house. That night I returned, too terrified to sleep anywhere else. The house was darker, colder. The shadows were everywhere now, filling the rooms, creeping along the walls. I made my way to the attic, searching for answers, and that's when I found it. A faded, yellowed photograph of a woman. Her eyes were hollow, dark, and stared right through me. I knew instantly she was the one in the whispers, the woman, the one who never left. Her name, scrawled on the back of the photo, sent a chill straight down my spine. Agnes Finch, 1874. She had died in that very house, a victim of a tragic winter storm, her body never found. The locals said she had been searching for something, waiting for someone, but she had vanished into the storm, never to return. The wind howled outside as I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't open. I pulled with all my strength, but it was as if something was holding it shut. That's when I heard the footsteps again, but this time they weren't in the hallway. They were behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. Then I saw her, Agnes. Her form was a shadow, more like a distortion in the air. Her face was pale, her features twisted with a sorrow so deep it seemed to reach into my very soul. She was reaching for me, her long, icy fingers slowly closing the gap between us. Leave, she whispered again, but this time there was a plea behind the words. I finally managed to break free, running back to the door, and with a burst of strength, I yanked it open. The storm had subsided, but the cold was unbearable, sharper than it had ever been. I never went back to that house. To this day, they say Agnes still haunts the old farmhouse, waiting for someone to come back, to listen to her plea. And on the coldest winter nights, if you stand near the house, you might hear the footsteps and the whisper. Leave. The wind howled through the trees like a wailing banshee as Rachel pulled her scarf tighter around her neck. The storm had come out of nowhere. 1 minute, the sky was clear, and the next, it was a blur of swirling snow, the world swallowed by white. The highway was barely visible as she drove, tires slipping on the icy road. She'd been on her way to her grandmother's house just a few miles away, but now, with the storm escalating, she was beginning to wonder if she'd made a mistake. She had no choice but to pull over when the snow began to pile up in the road. Visibility was nearly zero, and the wind outside was so fierce it felt like the car might be lifted off the ground. Rachel cursed under her breath. It wasn't like her to get stuck. She'd been driving this road for years, but something felt different tonight. There was a heaviness in the air, something oppressive. Her phone had no signal, and as she looked around the empty road, she thought of the nearest farmhouse she passed a few miles back. She didn't like the idea of walking in this storm, but what choice did she have? Her car wasn't going anywhere. She gathered what supplies she could, a flashlight, a blanket, and set off into the storm. The wind tore at her, almost as if it were trying to push her back, but she pressed on, her feet crunching in the thick snow. After what felt like hours, she finally reached the farmhouse. It looked abandoned, the windows dark, the roof heavy with snow. But there was a light flickering in the window, a dull, warm glow. Rachel knocked, her breath clouding in the freezing air. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time, and then a voice from inside the house called out, "Come in." She hesitated for a moment before she opened the door. The warmth hit her like a wave, and she stepped inside, shaking off the snow and wiping her red, frost-bitten cheeks. The house was old, dark wooden beams crisscrossing the ceiling. A fire burned in the hearth, casting eerie shadows on the walls. At the far end of the room, an old woman sat in a rocking chair, a woolen blanket draped over her lap. Her eyes were cloudy, her hair long and white as snow, her skin thin and translucent. "You look like you could use some rest, dear." The woman croaked, her voice raspy and soft, like something out of a dream. Rachel nodded, too tired to say much else. She was grateful for the shelter, for the warmth. She collapsed into an armchair by the fire and closed her eyes for just a moment. When she woke up, it was dark outside, far darker than it should have been. The storm still raged, but the house seemed oddly quiet. The woman was gone. Rachel blinked, confused. She didn't remember falling asleep, but the house felt wrong. It was colder now. The fire had burned down to embers. She stood up and moved to the window, peering out into the storm. The light she had seen earlier flickered again. But it wasn't from the farmhouse. It was from the barn, across the yard, at the edge of the forest. Something told her she shouldn't go outside, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had to. So she wrapped herself in the blanket she'd used to keep warm and ventured out. The barn door was ajar, creaking as it swung in the wind. The closer she got, the more uneasy she felt. The cold wrapped itself around her, like icy fingers clawing at her skin. She stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind her. Inside the barn. It was darker than she expected. She fumbled for the flashlight in her pocket, the beam cutting through the blackness. The barn was filled with old farm equipment, hay scattered on the ground, but something felt off. There was a shape in the far corner. Rachel's heart skipped a beat as she slowly approached it. As she neared, the shape seemed to shift, growing larger, more distinct. It was the old woman, but she wasn't sitting in a rocking chair anymore. She was standing, her back bent at an unnatural angle, her limbs twisted. Her hair was tangled, matted with something dark that looked like dried blood. And her eyes, those pale, milky eyes, were fixed on Rachel with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "I knew you'd come," the old woman whispered, her voice like ice scraping across stone. "I've been waiting for you." Rachel stepped back, her heart pounding. The air seemed to grow heavier, thick with the oppressive cold. The old woman took a step forward, her movement jerky, like she was being pulled by strings. The flashlight flickered. "You were supposed to stay with me," the woman croaked. "Stay here forever." Rachel turned to run, but the barn door slammed shut with a deafening bang. She screamed, her breath coming out in ragged gasps as the woman reached out, her bony fingers brushing Rachel's arm. Suddenly the door to the barn burst open. A blast of wind and snow swept inside, and the old woman screeched, her body twisting unnaturally as she was dragged back into the shadows. Rachel ran, her feet slipping on the icy ground as she stumbled away from the barn and toward the house. When she reached the farmhouse, she collapsed on the porch, panting, her heart still racing. But when she looked back toward the barn, there was no sign of the old woman. The storm had stopped. The air was eerily still. It wasn't until later that night, as Rachel lay in the bed inside the farmhouse, that she finally understood. The house hadn't been abandoned. The old woman was a spirit, trapped in the storm, waiting for anyone foolish enough to wander in. The last thing Rachel remembered before falling into an exhausted sleep was the whisper of a voice on the wind. "Stay with me forever." She never left the farmhouse. Some storms, they say, never truly end.